In today's episode, a woman who lived with several dangerous exotic animals, including big cats and bears, is attacked on her own property. A massive bear named Teddy seemingly snaps and attacks the woman unexpectedly, fatally mauling her. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying pet bear attack on Kelly Ann. Welcome to Final Affliction. Kelly Ann and Michael Walz lived on a picturesque property set on a hilltop, surrounded by friendly neighbors who they got along very well with. Looking at the pair, you'd never suspect them of being different from any other married couple. But in reality, they had a very unusual hobby. Michael and Kelly Ann liked to collect animals, and not just any animals. They had an affinity for exotic predators. You'd think that the neighbors would be worried about all of these murderous creatures in such close proximity to their homes and children. But according to them, the Walzes were excellent pet owners. Their cages were sturdy and secure. They had all of the proper licensing, and they passed every annual inspection of their property. The neighbors even made a game of spooking their visitors with the roars that echoed across the outskirts of Ross Township, Pennsylvania. In 1994, Michael procured a license to house exotic animals from across the seas, and they spent the next few years slowly filling their property with all sorts of dangerous meat eaters that could growl the pants off even the bravest men. A lion, 2 serval cats, a jaguar, a tiger, and a leopard. But their biggest and most loved animal was a fully grown black bear by the name of Teddy. Michael had the paperwork that gave him the right to sell and trade the animals that they kept. He could have even charged the public to visit his property like a mini zoo, but that wasn't what Michael and Kelly Ann were about. They just adored creatures that would normally scare the rest of us senseless. They saw the beauty in them where others couldn't, and if the neighbors were ever worried, well, they were encouraged to come and inspect the property themselves. The couple loved nothing more than to share their love for wild animals with their acquaintances, and their community found the pair and all of their animals quite charming. Even their next-door neighbor, Scott Castone, who had 2 young children, spoke very highly of the Walzes and what stellar animal keepers they were. He never once worried that the carnivorous cats would escape. Scott inspected their cages himself, and he visited his friends all the time, often bringing his own kids along. But it would be this very complacency that was to blame for the events that unfolded on that fateful day of October 2009. Kelly Ann herself raised Teddy since he was a cub, and the couple spoiled him with treats and attention. Teddy's favorite snack was popcorn, and he was Kelly Ann's pride and joy. Teddy was 350 pounds of pure muscle that was kept behind a 15 by 15 foot steel and concrete cage. In nature, black bears aren't exactly known for their tolerance of humans, but the handful that have been kept by people are reported to be much more mild-mannered than grizzlies. Unless it comes to food and they're young, then black bears are just as likely as any other wild animal to get aggressive. It's just in their natures, and no amount of training can override natural instinct. And to bring an even more serious tone to this situation, Teddy was even bigger than his kind normally grew to be. He had always been fed the best food. He never had to fight to survive, and he had never known sickness or hard times. Teddy was a black bear in his prime. Not only was he unimaginably strong and heavy, he stood at a height that was twice as tall as a man. The 6th of October was a Sunday, and the day started off cold and wet. A typical muggy fall morning in Pennsylvania, and a typical day for Kelly. After Michael left for the day, she and her own 2 children headed out bright and early to feed their many animals. Sunday was also the day that Kelly cleaned all of the cages on their land, so this was going to be a long and busy morning for her. Her first stop was always Teddy's cage. Kelly never missed a day where she didn't greet her beloved Teddy first. Kelly waved to her neighbor Scott over the fence. He was already up and about with his own 2 children, tending to some odd jobs around his house that he'd been putting off all week. Scott's kids waved hello to their friends before turning back to help their father. Kelly's children hung back on the porch. The night's sleep hadn't quite left them, and they were still too groggy to show much enthusiasm for the day just yet. But Kelly didn't mind. She loved spending her mornings with the animals, and most of all, with Teddy. She rode the wheelbarrow right to the edge of the cage's door. She needed to shovel up Teddy's messes before laying down some fresh straw to keep his paws clear of the muddy ground. But before she entered the cage, Teddy got a shovelful of food. That shovel wasn't going to be enough to fill the gigantic bear's stomach, but it was enough to keep him occupied while she wheeled her tools in through the door. It's not like she wanted to keep Teddy occupied enough to ignore herself. He'd never shown any aggression toward Kelly after all, but she did want to keep Teddy busy enough not to notice the open door. The bear wouldn't hesitate to leave his enclosure if he was given half the chance, but food was an even bigger incentive than freedom, so Teddy never even bothered to look up from his breakfast while Kelly got busy. Teddy knew the drill by now, and he was excitedly awaiting his treat. Standing on his hind legs, he pawed at the cage and growled a deep good morning to his owner. Teddy was going through the usual motions because that was what was expected of him. But, in truth, Teddy was not in a good mood at all. Everything in Teddy's body was telling him that it was time to go into hibernation. Autumn was in full swing, and this is usually the time when black bears got ready to take that long slumber. Teddy had been pacing his cage for the past week. Back and forth, looking for a way out to get to the woods where he belonged. The frustration was building up, and his owners, who usually saw him during the excitement of feeding time, didn't notice the bear's growing agitation. But for now, Teddy was seemingly happily rooting around in his pile of food. Kellyanne dragged the wheelbarrow inside with the shovel in hand, and the first few shovels of waste bedding that she hauled into the wheelbarrow went without incident. When her load was nearly overflowing, she put her shovel aside and turned to wheel the first load of mess out the door. But this sudden movement was all that Teddy needed to awaken that primal force within him. His natural instinct to protect his food, coupled with that volatile irritation that came with the need to hibernate outside in nature, just exploded out of the animal. Teddy did not see the woman who raised him, he just saw a potential threat. And with speed that belied his massive size, the beast landed on Kellyanne in one smooth bound. The air in Kelly's lungs whooshed out of her as almost 400 pounds rammed her to the ground, and by the time there was air in her lungs again to scream, Teddy had already had his jaws sunk into her shoulder. The ferocious roars and Kelly's screaming traveled to Scott's yard. He looked up with a frown that quickly turned into a look of horror when he saw the bloodbath that was unfolding in front of him. The air was alive with noise. Both his and Kelly's children were screaming hysterically. Kelly's kids had run into the house the moment the bear attacked. His enclosure was open, and they were going to be next if they didn't get out of the way fast. Scott leapt into action. It took him 30 seconds to run to his house, get his sidearm, load it, and sprint across his yard. When he reached Teddy's enclosure, Kelly was lying motionless on the ground, just a few feet from the open door. If Scott didn't know what happened, he never would have recognized the torn and broken human being that lay before him. Teddy was still on top of her. He gave the body one last shake, and when it became clear that his target was deceased, Teddy turned to the next threat before him, and that threat was Scott. The man was only a few feet away. Teddy could cover that distance in just 4 strides, but Scott was ready. The bear went low, gearing to storm at Scott on all fours, but before the beast could take 2 steps, Scott pulled the trigger, and he pulled it again and again and again. The first bullet hit Teddy in the abdomen. His thick fur and copious amounts of fat shielded him from most of the damage. It wasn't nearly enough to bring him down. Teddy recoiled from the blast, but he recovered in a split second and took a step forward. Then the second round hit him, and that was the lethal one. It hit the creature in the neck. Even without the shots that followed, that torn airway rendered his breathing obsolete. The animal hit the earth with a force that shook the ground like a freight train went past. Even the children inside the house felt the shockwave from the floorboards beneath their feet. Of the 5 shots fired, Scott managed to get 2 into the animal's skull. Even if Teddy had enough oxygen left in him for one last attack, those final rounds were more than enough to cut any remaining signs of life short instantly. And with that, two beings lay dead on the ground. Kellyanne, a woman who left behind two children and a husband who adored her, and yet now her torn and broken body lay under the canopy of the autumn rain. Forever gone from this world, a life ended in less than a minute, and the other was a majestic beast, the iconic black bear that millions of stuffed toys are modeled after. If it weren't for the screams of the children, Scott would have stared at the gruesome scene in shock for hours. Next door, Scott's kids called 911 when they heard the shots ring out, but the paramedics just arrived to remove the bodies. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Scott and all of the children are traumatized by the events of the day. Scott can at least find solace in the fact that his actions almost certainly saved lives. If Teddy had made it out of the Walz's yard, the bear, already in a blind rage, would have attacked the first living thing that he came across. But these events did leave plenty of food for thought. How could Kelly have just left that gate wide open? Why was there no separate holding cage to keep the bear in while she cleaned? But the Walz's neighbors came to their defense. In all ways, Kellyanne did everything that the state required of an exotic keeper, and the bear was, by all accounts, tame and friendly. The fact of the matter is, no matter how young you get them, wild animals are just that. Wild animals. Complacency is not a sin. Kellyanne has done this routine 1,000 times with no problems at all. Number 1001 just happened to be the perfect storm. The change in season, food to protect, and natural instincts were just the perfect recipe for disaster. So while the news spread and the world had plenty of criticism to throw at the situation, there are children who lost their mother, a husband who lost his wife, and a whole community left reeling in shock. And then there's Scott Castone, the man who did not hesitate to face down one of the biggest animals that walks on land to save his friend, his children, and the community at large. There are two lessons that we can take away from this terrible event. One is that animals belong in the wild, no matter how much we love them and even how much they love us. Natural instinct is stronger than love for the creatures that are wild. And secondly, we can celebrate the bravery of the members of our community. Scott couldn't save Kellyanne, but he did save others from being attacked. There are still heroes out there willing to put their lives on the line so others won't have to meet their terrifying final affliction.